Is the Islamic Republic of Iran about to fall? Mass protests have swept the country over the past few days, originally focused on the economic crisis in the country, but that's clearly extended to opposition to the regime. What is how significant is this? I'm also very interested in obviously the role of the US, Israel, and the role of Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the deposed Shah of Iran, who had a very brutal dictatorship, a US-backed dictatorship back in the 1970s, which was installed in 1953 after a CIA and MI6-backed coup against the progressive government. Could the country fall apart? Balkanization. There's lots to talk about, and no better person to speak to than Sina, Toossi, who is an Iranian-American analyst, senior fellow at Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C. It's great to speak to you. How are you doing?
Hey, Owen. Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be on here.
It's great to speak to you again. I guess firstly, just how significant is this? Is this existential? Because we've seen back in 2022, 2019, obviously before that, 2009, mass protests, which actually became millions of people on the streets, but ultimately they didn't succeed. How significant do you think these are compared to those previous protests?
Yeah, I think, to judge the significance of these protests, that's the right approach, just to weigh them against the barometer of the past major protest movements in Iran. Because as I'm sure most of the people watching this know, and even people who've tangentially followed Iran, there's been waves of protests every several years, especially for the past 15 years, really. So the first big kind of nationwide protest movement was the Green protest that occurred after the contested re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the conservative candidate in 2009, against the reformist candidate then Mir Hossein Mousavi. And so basically, Ahmadinejad was declared the winner of that election. Mousavi rejected those results, and his supporters took to the streets. And at one point in Tehran, according to government officials themselves and Iran state media, 3 million people took to the streets. And that movement, it originated from a reformist insider of the system, Mousavi, who was a former prime minister during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. But it did, have demands for basically fundamental political change. Mousavi, by the time he, became the leader of that opposition movement, his rhetoric, his demands, took on a kind of more, certainly a radical position, but even, to the point of really challenging the system. Regardless, those protests were repressed. They fizzled out. And the Islamic Republic in 2011 put Mousavi, along with some fellow leaders of that era, under house arrest, and he actually remains under house arrest to this day. So anyway, so that was that Green movement in 2009 was largely urban, largely middle class led. It wasn't as much in kind of some of the provinces and some of these kind of more rural areas. You fast forward to the winter of 2017, 2018, when there was another kind of nationwide protest movement in Iran. These were smaller, both in magnitude and in kind of scope. But what did distinguish them were that they were in a lot of these more kind of provincial areas, in places where up until that point, the regime hadn't necessarily seen that much organized protest activity against it. Yet, they were a small, limited movement. They were also sparked by economic conditions and kind of actually, interestingly, the bazaar-y grievances in the bazaar. But, given, the deep-seated discontent that does exist in Iran that permeates across large parts of Iranian society, most of Iran, the majority of Iranian society, even government supporters, are deeply discontent, for example, with the economic situation. But in general, people are very deeply discontent. So that protest did morph into, more overtly anti-regime, anti-system slogans, as we've seen, from the Green movement onwards. Things like death to the dictator, death to velayat faqih, which is the rule of clerical jurisprudence and kind of the ideological underpinning of the Islamic Republic system. So anyway, so those are two. I don't want to go on too long, but so those are those two. Then we had the November 2019 protest movement that was triggered by a fuel price hike that Similar to what's happened since last night, that was the only other time they did a blunt nationwide blackout of internet, like access to the global internet. And, it was heavily repressed, again, catalyzed by economic grievance. Fuel price hike quickly became, you know, as part of this broader anti-government sentiment. That protest movement also similarly was not as much in the urban cores, like the major big cities like Tehran or Esfahan, but more in kind of more rural provincial hubs. Then you had the 2022 Women Life Freedom movement, sparked by the death in custody of Mahsa Amini. And you saw that movement was really led by younger people, teenagers, people in their 20s, also tapped into, the existing, deep-seated discontent. That movement spread to many parts of Iran as well, similar to some of these other ones in recent years, but did bring more middle class people to the forefront. Maybe not as much working class people or other broader segments of society, as has been argued since then. That movement also fizzled out, was, repressed. And so that leads us to this current situation after the war. I mean, obviously, the Iranian government has been heavily opposed by the US and Israel for their own geopolitical interests. That I think we should distinguish, what's going on the geopolitical front versus, the Iranian people and their own struggles for representative governments, just better governance. But obviously, these external forces are trying to exploit that and manipulate it towards their own ends, which sadly I don't think is to the benefit of what the people of Iran are ultimately wanting. Regardless, we saw that during the war in last June, Netanyahu and them really did bet on regime change, regime collapse, protests breaking out. That did not happen. They bombed everything from police stations to the national television headquarters to Evin prison, which, there's a lot of political prisoners there. Yet protests did not break out. It was a time of national cohesion, people rallying not behind the regime, but behind each other, behind defense of the homeland, worried about obviously their country falling apart, this, foreign aggression. So now we've had this situation where protests broke out again. I would argue organically, naturally, not as a result of, the foreign intervention is there in the background, trying to instigate, trying to amplify. But these protests occurred in a objectively deteriorating economic condition, objectively, depreciation of the Iranian currency, high inflation, over 40%, and people having very genuine grievances, and especially over economic issues, but this system that ultimately has not delivered in many ways, in terms of political rights, social rights, economic rights. These are all genuine, deep-seated grievances that many Iranians have had for a long time. But you saw that these protests on December 28th broke out, where in the Tehran Bazaar, with an interesting constituency, it was in this commercial district, which was importers of mobile phones and technology merchants, basically people who sell imported technology. So they are obviously a constituency in the marketplace, in the Iranian kind of commercial sector, that is hardest hit by the depreciation of the currency, because then people can't afford foreign phones. Anyways, they went on strike for that day and protested. It wasn't political slogans at that beginning, just economic grievances. The next day it spilled into kind of surrounding areas in that commercial area. And then since then, it had been scattered. We'd had days, of reoccurring protests in Iran. Tehran was one of the cities where there was reoccurring protests in different places. So it left the bazaar, then came back to the bazaar again, like several days ago. But then, the hot spot really became other parts of the country, other people, as part of this, this momentum that was generated as part of these deep-seated grievances, came to the street and protest. And that quickly became, again, this pattern of, quickly becoming anti-system, anti-government, wanting fundamental political change, thinking, it's not working out with the system, people wanting major political change. And so the hotspot up until now had really been in Western Iran, interestingly, up in this province called Elam province, which is on the border of Iraq, where there's been harsh repression, a number of killings by security forces, including a hospital where they fired tear gas into it, and they tried to prevent kind of people from, protesters from getting medical treatment. So that resulted in bigger protests. And then what we interestingly have also seen is that the government has been in a way, up until now, somewhat restrained in terms of the brutality and repression that it has used in the past. So this is in a context where, Pezeshkian, a reformist within the system, is president, where he's kind of pushed for, easing social restrictions, easing some kind of political and speech restrictions, um, and kind of overseeing certain economic uh, surgeries and economic reforms that have been painful, but basically reforming Iran's kind of very corruption inducing subsidy system, which we can get into later as part of this. But so, the restraint has been so far as, Pezeshkian has been openly saying, we have to allow these demonstrations that are peaceful. People are, have legitimate grievances. We have to talk to the demonstrators. He organized meetings with the representatives of those Bazari merchants, for example. And then you saw, interestingly, in the past couple days, actually, these protests, these demonstrations happening where security forces were not clamping down. They were actually walking side by side with them or escorting them or waving at them from, for example, in Elam, which was a hotspot, like waving at them.
Mm.
There's this video that went viral where security forces are waving at protesters from the rooftop. So, some people took this to mean like, oh, the security forces are defecting, whatever. But I don't think that is not what was happening. I mean, there was tactical restraints, I would argue, from the government, and I can, I'll explain why and why that changed yesterday. Because even yesterday, what happened yesterday was, these protests have been continuing. They've had momentum. And then Reza Pahlavi, actually, so this former crown prince, the son of the former Shah, called for demonstrations. And people, for the first time, really turned out because he's called for demonstrations dozens of times over the past many years. So for the first time, and we can get into like, is that because of his call? Is that for other factors? We can get into that. But regardless, there were sizable numbers, videos on social media that I've seen. It's hard to ascertain, but in the thousands of people, hundreds of low thousands of people in Tehran and Mashhad and other big cities. And the interesting thing is that initially, these it seemed from the videos that I was watching, similar to what had been going on in the past like day or two, security forces were not intervening. And then you saw the internet goes out, harsh clampdown, which by all accounts is ongoing. The internet is still largely, and this is a internet restriction. And again, I can go into more detail about these internet restrictions that is more severe than anyone we'd seen, for example, in the Women Life Freedom movement. And it goes back really to that 2019 November fuel price hike protest, where basically the internet, when it comes to networks connected to from outside of the country, is cut off. And they have this domestic intranet, which was even affected, but now seems to be at least partly back online, and domestic messengers. But now it seems like, so I think their calculation, the government's calculation, is really talking not to their diehard base, which I would argue that the diehard base of the Islamic Republic is probably like 20% of the population, maybe 20, 30%. And the diehard opponents arguably are bigger than they have been. And maybe you can, it's a very polarized society, and arguably they are probably 20 to 30% too. These are my speculations that I would argue are informed speculations, but regardless for the purpose of this. But I think, there's this middle of Iranian society that what direction they go in, this 50 to 60% that is deeply discontent as well, but that is worried about taking to the streets, instability. The record of Iran in the modern era has been a concern, something that worries many people, to return to conditions of war and strife and all of that. So I think, the part of the government's game in Pezeshkian has been to, as a prelude to harsh crackdown, be like, we try, we allowed some protests. We were, they became riots, quote unquote. They were violent. But regardless, I think, it remains, we'll have to see how it plays out. I think ultimately it's going to depend on where a critical mass of Iranians go. Like if the government represses harshly, intimidates, people from coming into the streets, and the calculation for that critical mass, that middle chunk of Iranian society, is to stay at home and not take to the streets. I think similar to past protest cycles, it'll fizzle out under this repression, but yet the state is still going to be in this very, very weakened state with no real good options, and probably more protests coming or lasting in some capacity over time. Or if a critical mass of people do decide like to take to the streets, they've had enough, and then we can move into, might move into a full blown uprising revolutionary moment. I think Obviously, we can't say with certainty as of now, but that's kind of just my lay of the landscape as of right now.
I mean, in terms of the economic factors, how much is that to do with the sanctions which have been imposed on the country, and how much is corruption, for example, by Iranian officials, which is also obviously caused huge anger?
Yeah, I mean, I would say sanctions are definitely the decisive factor in terms of the level of economic deterioration in Iran. Obviously, mismanagement, bad government policies, corruption, these things have aggravated them. But the economic conditions that Iran has been under, and I mean, the economic siege, it really is a historically unprecedented economic siege. And same with Venezuela as well. Like people kind of
Mm.
like I saw in The Economist that there was this graph about like Venezuela's economy was good and then socialism came and then it tanked. I'm like, we're kind of leaving out that there was a major economic
Mhm.
siege of Venezuela and sanctions and policies that were aimed at crumbling the society. And same with Iran. So that it's been under this maximum pressure campaign from the US since 2018, since that nuclear deal that Obama had negotiated, which gave them some sanctions relief. Trump reneged on that, imposed maximum pressure, which has really been a regime change policy and an explicit part of these policies. And many people will say this quiet part out loud. Certainly in this era, like I saw John Fetterman the other day talked about. I mean, the quiet part is that, these sanctions are designed to create unrest and create turmoil and result in regime change. So obviously, like John Fetterman, for example, had a tweet basically saying that, but that is more or less the explicit goal. Um, and so, but with that said, I don't, I think we have to be careful not to use that as an excuse or
Yeah.
not to misunderstand where Iranians from Iran are coming from, because from the
Yeah.
vantage point of someone in Iran who has shitty internet, doesn't have a good job, has they can't afford basic necessities, it's very rational for them to be like, okay, well, why are we we have this fight with America, why do we have this fight with America and Israel? Like, I can't even afford anything, this cost is too high, it's your fault, to their government for getting us in this situation. Like, look, Turkey's doing well, other countries are doing well. Why are we in this position? So, that's what people in Iran, I think, can very reasonably and rationally come to that conclusion that this is ultimately a condition that their government has contributed to. And, but, in the broader situation right now with Trump and Netanyahu, obviously very unabashedly endorsing
Mm.
these protests and kind of claiming to be intervening. I mean, usually you would assume they would try to keep their role and to give legitimacy to protests, but there's no pretense of that. And it's unclear what, that might embolden in my count, my assessment, a certain minority of protests and protesters. But for that critical mass of Iranian society, that middle part that is discontent, but that is wary of foreign intervention, I think that kind of pushes them further away. I may be wrong. We'll see. But we've seen, for example, like Mike Pompeo, Trump's former,
Mm.
Secretary of State, CIA director, literally tweeted last week that Mossad is on the ground alongside these protesters. So, I mean, it
Right.
could be bravado. I mean, obviously, Mossad has lots of influence in Iran, and I don't want to certainly on my end delegitimize any. I think again, these are deep-seated,
Mm.
legitimate grievances. The protests are organic, but definitely they're there trying to aggravate everything, and they have their tentacles in there trying to destabilize the country. And ultimately, that's not what the Iranian people want. I mean, the Iranian people obviously want a more secure livelihood, economic stability, prosperity, and stability. I think globally there is this kind of backtracking from aspirations seemingly for democracy or human rights. I mean, Iran's opposition movement, which we can get into this in a bit, like, that this I would distinguish between Iran's civil society, domestic opposition movement, people who for years have advocated for democratic change and who are real like Democrats, like liberal
Mm.
Democrats who but that, I think globally, including in Iranian politics and opposition politics, that's just taken the back seat, right? So you have someone like Reza Pahlavi who doesn't even make any pretense to have that kind of rhetoric. And for many Iranians, I think, if they can get even a strong man kind of leader who can bring them stability, bring them economic prosperity, good relations with the rest of the world, America, get them out from under sanctions, that's enough. So that is one change I've noticed in Iran and Iranian opposition politics, as well as globally, really.
Hmm. I mean, with Reza Pahlavi, he was obviously the son of the deposed Shah, and it must be, of course, remembered that that Shah of Iran, oversaw an extremely brutal regime, which was overwhelmingly opposed by the Iranian people. I mean, obviously, the mass disillusionment that was bred by that regime led to a revolution. So, I mean, which did have huge support at the time in 1979, 1980, and so on. 1978, 79. With Reza Pahlavi, I'm interested in his incarnation in terms of how he's presenting himself, because my understanding is, particularly a lot of the people around him, he's kind of got closer to basically kind of far right Trumpian elements. Is that correct? And when he talks about a constitutional monarchy. Although I don't know how much his rhetoric is along those lines anymore, it used to be. Do you think in practice, actually, he would just end up being the dictator of Iran and a different sort of dictatorship?
Yeah, I think with Pahlavi, the main thing is like, could he, his politics and the politics of his movement and his closest advisors, and he himself is a little bit more careful in his rhetoric, or historically has been, but everyone around him and the politics that he enables and certainly is behind, is very exclusionary and very like hegemonic. Like they're not willing. If you just follow, if I've been following them for the past couple of years pretty closely, like they've been going after other opposition figures much, as much, if not more than the Islamic Republic itself, trying to like get rid of everyone else and just have them be, basically be the opposition, and have, everyone has to either kind of like either be with them or be with the Islamic Republic. You can't be like Nargis Mohammadi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who they attack vociferously, or other people from political prisoners in Iran or whatnot. And so, yeah, their politics has, I would argue, has foremost centered on getting external support for regime change in Iran, not as much as investing in kind of the hard roots, grassroots work of building a movement, building an inclusive movement, building a movement that's inclusive of ethnic minorities like the Kurds, Baluch, the Azaris in Iran, and building a movement that can appeal across kind of political ideologies to really be the kind of inclusive movement that you would need to build a critical mass to have a revolution, much like the revolution that happened against the Shah, actually, which obviously afterwards Khomeini sidelined all the other opposition and took power, but notably before 1979, Khomeini was actually trying to be inclusive and deceptive ultimately, but working with other groups against the Shah. And there was a much more broad revolution. And then it became, something more exclusionary like the Islamic Republic. But, for Pahlavi and them beforehand, they've had this strategy, and, they have a base. And I think, the base is really a testament to the discontent and anger within Iran, the lack of a good alternative, certain actions by the Islamic Republic itself, and really heavily repressing all the other opposition, from Green Movement, Mousavi, Mohammadi, other insiders who became are actual liberal Democrats who actually have much more of an inclusionary politics. But they're in prison. They haven't been able to organize. They don't have these massive media networks before them. So the monarchist movement amongst the Iranian opposition is extremely well funded, heavily and openly supported by Israel and elements in the US. I mean, by the Israeli government, insofar as they meet with Netanyahu, they meet with his intelligence minister. They have this outlet called Iran International, which we know is basically backed by Israel, most likely funded by Israel, and heavily kind of used by Mossad. Even like Barak Ravid said, Mossad uses them for their disinformation. So they are staunchly just propping him up. Other outlets there's a lot of social media manipulation that we know is social media manipulation from places like Citizen Lab of the University of Toronto, research that they've done. Haaretz actually did a big expose of that a couple months ago. So, but that's not all to say that, it's all, there's this heavy astroturfing thing and heavy kind of thing to prop them up. But, they have legitimate supporters. They have people on the ground as well. I think a lot of that is nostalgia for the Pahlavi era. Again, deep-seated discontent for the Islamic Republic, lack of an alternative. But I don't see Pahlavi emerging as this kind of opposition leader. He's trying to position himself that. Even just now, he was calling on Trump to do military strikes tonight. I just saw
Yeah.
someone posting about that. But he's going to bet that muster enough support to make get Trump to think he's their guy, get Trump to think that if you give a push, the whole thing falls apart and he can get credit for it. I think that's wishful thinking. I mean, the Iranian Islamic Republic has much more, a lot more coercive capability that it's using, that it still hasn't used the full extent of it. Things can get a lot uglier before they even show, I think, any inclination of getting better. But I think, for the calculation of most of these protesters in Iran, I would even argue it's not about Pahlavi. It's about getting enough, generating that momentum. If Pahlavi is supporting that, if he's saying it, they'll take it. And they obviously want to do what's best for themselves and build a big movement and, get a better government and have a better situation for themselves. But there's just a lot of nefarious forces at play, obviously from the regime foremost, but also externally, Trump, Netanyahu, and all these other actors.
On that, because you mentioned Venezuela, what happened there was they got rid of, by kidnapping, the President Maduro, and then basically did a pact. Well, not a pact. I mean, it's not really a pact if you got a gun pointed at your head, but that basically kept the regime in place, but basically said, "You'll do as we say." Now, Iran is obviously a different kettle of fish. It's much further away. It's a much bigger country, and much more sizable country in lots of different ways. But is it possible that you could see something similar, where you basically get a decapitation? I mean, obviously the supreme leader of Iran is Khamenei, and where Trump does a deal with elements of the regime to do a similar approach as Venezuela.
Yeah, I would argue that Venezuela and Iran are different in major ways with respect to this question. And first, I mean, it really remains unclear to me exactly what America has achieved or is going to achieve with Venezuela. It seems like there's many known unknowns and questions that remain to be answered. Obviously, this is not a regime change that he did with Venezuela. He kidnapped Maduro. Maduro's deputy was sworn in. Interestingly, when she was sworn in a couple days ago, I saw a video where she went and warmly embraced the ambassadors of Iran, China, and Russia. And so and the U.S. is now apparently pulling out some of these military assets in the Caribbean, and they're trying to take some 50 million barrels of oil or something. We'll see. But yeah, so it's just different, and we'll see exactly how that plays out. With respect to Iran, the Islamic Republic is much more entrenched in this Venezuelan system, both in respect to like the economic damage that it has received. I mean, Venezuela, which was much further along economic collapse than Iran has, even now, like they were in hyperinflation, for example, where Iran was like 40% in inflation, and they're adjusting subsidies and trying to give vouchers and redirect some, their kind of social safety nets and welfare system. And they have multiple layers of control in Iran. So Khamenei, is a figurehead, is kind of a consensus figure, but really the main powers, the Revolutionary Guards, various security bodies, political bodies, entrenched interests groups, and elites who have a lot to lose if the current system falls apart. They, they have all the guns, they have the resources, so they have a lot of means to kind of hold out. And so, I mean, basically, I think, and in this question of if he assassinates Khamenei and tries to make a deal with some other element of the system who could be more pragmatic, or at least come to some terms like, hey, we won't enrich, we're not going to bother Israel, you lift sanctions, let's make a deal. I mean, I guess that's plausible. I just think that, Khamenei is more like Khamenei and his kind of level, his loyalists and his kind of base, and him being kind of one of the original 1979 revolutionary leaders, makes that calculation more complicated, much more prone to resulting in kind of just backlash, doubling down, another hardliner comes to replace him, or kind of a military-led, IRGC-led dictatorship that doesn't change all that much. But I mean, I don't necessarily discount it, because even within, among the elite contestation in Iran, in the Islamic Republic, there's a lot of discontent. There's a lot of unhappiness with Khamenei, with his policies, especially from the more kind of moderate reformist camps within Iran. But I think, Khamenei has enough. My assessment is that he has enough layers of control and kind of security and intelligence apparatuses that he's going to, try to stay one step ahead of those
Mhm.
efforts. But I don't necessarily discount it. But even if that scenario were to happen, obviously that's not what these protesters in Iran want. And that's just, if anything, the US proving that, they just care about their own geopolitical interests, and Iran can, whatever the domestic situation is, it's not really that big of a deal. Just like they deal with dictators all around the world and prop them up
Mhm.
or support Israel. That's, genocidal expansionist state.
I mean, just in terms of that, the role of Israel, and also, well, obviously Israel and bombed Iran, and there was a 12-day war between the two countries last year. As you say, openly talking about interfering. I mean, you can see a strategy across the Middle East. Some would argue that what they would prefer is chaos in Iran. They're not to be a properly functioning government. Iran is, is a rich tapestry, ethnically, demographically, and so on. And there's the spectre of balkanization. What do you think about that? I mean, the role of Israel, and then just the more broader general threat of balkanization, civil war, for example.
Yeah, I would. I mean, from my vantage point in Washington, and, conversations that I've had with, you know, American officials, ex-officials, people who know the Israeli thinking. I mean, I would argue that the Israeli regional interest, and I think this is very evident, obviously, in their policies, what they've done, their rhetoric, is for the region to be fragmented largely along ethnic and sectarian lines, and to not have any strong central, states with strong centralized governments. We can see this playing out right now in Syria, where they're trying to push very hard for the fragmentation of Syria.
Mhm.
Obviously, they just unilaterally recognized Somaliland, and, tearing apart Somalia, tearing apart, which is an Arab League member in the Arab world. Um, and so vis-a-vis, and, they've had those aspirations for Iraq, and, we can get into that. But I don't, I would say that's not the American interest, fragmentation and kind of that kind of level of instability in the Middle East. So I would say that Israel, Reza Pahlavi is their guy. If
Mhm.
they can get him as the alternative in Iran, that would be preferable, but I really don't think they're betting on that outcome. And I don't think they think he could pull that country together, or really, become the leader there. And the more likely outcome for them, that which is an outcome that they would be, I think, prefer ultimately in the bigger strategic long-term picture, is that, Iran, as you said, has these ethnic fault lines. Interestingly, these ethnic groups in Iran, like the Kurds, the Baluch, the Azaris, and others, the Arabs, they actually have a very generally very poor record with the Pahlavi dynasty that ruled for much of the 20th century. That was a very centralizing force. Like, Reza Shah, the grandfather of this current guy, who ruled in the 20s and 30s and 40s, he, centralized the Iranian state. And as part of that, there was a lot of repression of these kind of ethnic periphery regions of Iran, and that continued under his son. So they're not on board with, they want a kind of federalized, pluralistic future Iran, which is not what Pahlavi's supporters now say. Like,
Yeah.
online, like, they're very dogmatic, and they have their own form of kind of Iranian nationalism that is very exclusionary as well, I would argue. Regardless, for Israel, I think this plays into that balkanization aspiration. And for Iran, that is, engulfed in internal turmoil for years, decades, couple generations, is perfectly fine for them. As a
Mhm.
small state that is an ethno supremacist state themselves, that is expansionist, that, these big countries in the region as potential strategic rivals, even if the Islamic Republic goes, who's going to emerge ultimately, who could emerge later. Um, so I think their interests is ultimately in that kind of fragmentation of the region, not just Iran. And we can see this, in Libya. Libya's been, Libya was, for better or for worse, one of the more powerful countries in North Africa. and right now just been locked in civil war and discord for the past 15 years, for various reasons. I'm not trying to necessarily blame, say, but I'm that these
Mhm.
kind of external interventions from Libya to Syria to Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, you know, now we're seeing in the Horn of Africa that they've been content with this kind of strategic landscape going in this direction. And they have this idea of fortress Israel, expand greater Israel. The US, I would say, is different. The US, and there's many forces that are trying to obviously push US foreign policy towards the Middle East in various directions. But I think as close as we get to like a rationally stated objective US quote unquote interest towards the Middle East and West Asia and the Persian Gulf. And this is this has been the direction they've tried to been pivot. They have tried to pivot towards, starting with Obama, was for the longest time. I mean, if you go towards the Shah's time, for example, they had this policy called the Twin Pillars policy, where Saudi Arabia and the Iran under the Shah were the kind of the pillars of U.S. In preserving U.S. interests in the region, securing the Persian Gulf in line with U.S. preferences and in the U.S. orbit, and kind of keeping out Soviet influence is the main great power rival of America then. Then you saw in the 80s when Iran fell out of the U.S. orbit, they had what many describe as kind of an offshore balancing, where the U.S. directly didn't intervene, but it was content with Iran and Iraq fighting each other for 8 years, and there being no kind of hegemon or dominant power that arose in the Persian Gulf that could really dominate the Persian Gulf outside of the U.S. orbit in a way that could harm U.S. interests in that energy and keeping that energy ultimately under its strategic control. And then I would say after the Cold War, beginning in the early 90s, America kind of went to become itself the hegemonic power in the Middle East. So having this kind of extra regional hegemony, sending in hundreds of thousands of troops after the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein, having dual containment against Saddam's Iraq and then against the Islamic Republic. And then under Bush, trying to transform the region to really lock in this domineering U.S. architecture in line with American and Israeli preferences to kind of really dominate the region. And I think to a large extent that has continued to be the policy, even under multiple administrations. This goal, this idealistic goal of transforming the region along these lines, which has been has met setback after setback, quagmire after quagmire. Iraq, Afghanistan, the Arab Spring then happened, which created its own host of challenges, and then the Syrian civil war. And now we're in this new world where, it's emerging multipolarity. America is no longer in this moment of Pax Americana, the unbridled global unipolar power, superpower. And so it has much more limited options. It's increasingly more limited, and the aspirations we can get into. But, for example, the Trump national security document is more of like, we want regional hegemony in the Western hemisphere. And it kind of explicitly, more or less, which is a trend that, again, from Obama, like, the Middle East, we've invested all of these resources. This goal of transforming it militarily hasn't turned out good for us. There's still, I think, previously under Bush, the idea was you break it and then you fix it in line with what you want. So we're going to go to Afghanistan and Iraq and spend trillions of dollars and try to build these pro-US orders. That failed. I think under Obama, we kind of adopted this kind of break it and leave it, like Libya or Syria. But, these countries are kind of not in the US orbit. Break it and leave it. But, that has had its own challenges. But I think now with Trump, it seems like we are kind of what makes with the national security document and a lot of the rhetoric and kind of discussions in Washington, this idea of, having, again, offshore balancing in the Persian Gulf, in the Middle East. So primarily, it's not that the U.S. will want to intervene heavily militarily, engage in these kind of big wars and costly wars and destabilization. And destabilization would ultimately harm U.S. interests in many ways, refugee flows, destabilizing other allies. But, having a situation where there's rough balance of power between the local powers, like you can talk about like a Saudi-led part of the region, a Turkish-led part of the region, obviously Iran, that has been a power up until now. Israel, I think we can set that aside. That's the U.S. relationship there is different. But And so I think with respect to what's happening in Iran now, regardless of whatever future government, the American interest would be in terms of like keeping that future Iran closer to it, having a balance where neither that future Iran or the Gulf countries or any other regional
Mhm.
power can have a dominating position in the Persian Gulf, and yet they're not going in the Chinese camp or the Russian camp or in this emerging multipolar order, so to prevent inroads from them. But I think that's different than the Israeli interest completely, which is not having regional integration in line with kind of American preferences or anything
Right.
like that, but having instability and fragmentation. So them as an ethno supremacist state that is expansionist could have long term security and kind of expansion in this region.
Just finally, where if you were going to predict, I know these predictions maybe are not generally wise, but in terms of what we've seen with previous protests, what do you think the likely outcome is? Do you think it is likely to go the same direction as previous protests, mass protest movements, 2009, 2019, 2022? Or do you think this actually could be credibly existential for the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Yeah, I think so. Broadly, just to go over the potential scenarios, one is these become a revolutionary moment coupled with maybe some foreign intervention of various means. The Islamic Republic is toppled, and there's some kind of smooth transition to new order without a lot of instability or violence or civil conflict. Another possible scenario is that, as in the past, the Islamic Republic represses these protests. They kind of fizzle out for now, and things return to the kind of previous status quo that held after the Green Movement, after the Women, Life, Freedom. Like the regime holds on for now, while it's facing still a lot of discontent and prospect of more protests. Another one is the state weakens, collapses. There's foreign military intervention that contributes to that, and Iran kind of descends into internal turmoil, chaos, civil conflict for some long duration of time. So among these, again, I'm very averse to make a prediction. I would say probably if these next couple of days are going to be very critical. I think decisive for the trajectory of the protests. So we'll see if protests grow, or if this repression, these internet shutdowns, and this kind of harsh crackdown by the state, much like in the previous years, prevents this critical mass of Iranians from coming to the streets, or if they grow and we do reach that critical mass and we do reach this kind of regime change scenario. So I would think, as of right now, based off current evidence, given that there have been no defections, there have been no cracks within the state, that's key to watch out for. I would say it's more likely that the regime holds out like it's done in the past through its kind of repressive apparatus, through its kind of the narrative it's offered the middle of Iranian society about the current situation. And then so making that's first scenario less likely, but that first scenario, I think, again, the next couple of days are going to be decisive. So I'm going to hold out. We'll see if more people take to the street, but that seems less likely. And this third scenario of war and conflict and domestic instability, I think that's also quite likely, sadly, that because Trump and Netanyahu and them obviously don't care about investing in some kind of big political project in Iran to build a better Iranian state. They'll be happy to break it and leave it. And if it gets broken, I think it could break quite badly. There's a lot of fault lines in Iran, and I really, I'm Iranian American. My family's there. I hope to God that does not come to pass, and the Iranian people can get what they've struggled for over a century. Iran has had, interestingly, democratic movements for a constitution that predate a lot of the movements even in Western Europe, like going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they had a constitutional revolution in the early 1900s. And so hopefully, on that quest to be a country that has representative governance, democratic governance, and also is independent and can kind of be sovereign and have its sovereignty respected, that's what the Iranian people want. I think all of those things I just said. So that's what I hold out hope for.
Brilliant stuff. I mean, so much to think over, and obviously it's been a dramatic few days. and there'll be lots more to talk about over the coming days and weeks. But please do make sure everyone you do follow Sina on social media, because you can get brilliant analysis all the way through. I think it's just at Sina Toossi, isn't it? Easy.
Yeah,
so,
Sina Toossi. Yeah.
So do make sure you follow him, and press like, subscribe, leave your thoughts and your comments. Do share the video, but really, really appreciate it again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.